Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the most horrifying death you can possibly conceive. Now multiply that horror by 1,000. Add the stench of rotting flesh that could knock you unconscious from 3 rooms away, and picture a corpse so grotesquely swollen that it literally exploded during a funeral procession. When the coffin burst open, putrid fluids spilled across the sacred chapel floor, while stray dogs crept in to lap up the remains of what was once the most powerful man in England. This isn't some medieval nightmare dreamed up by Gothic novelists. This is the absolutely true, stomach-churning end of Henry VIII, a king whose transformation from golden god to rotting monster reads like the most twisted fairy tale ever told. But before we dive deeper into this incredible tale of power, corruption, and ultimate decay, I need something from you. The stories I tell require countless hours of research, and your support through subscriptions and likes helps me bring these fascinating historical accounts to life. So please, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your engagement means I can continue uncovering these incredible true stories that are often stranger than any fiction Hollywood could produce. The story begins on a perfect summer morning in 1491 at Greenwich Palace, where church bells rang out across London to announce the birth of Catherine of York's second son. The royal household celebrated, but without the overwhelming joy that had greeted his older brother Arthur's arrival. After all, this new prince was merely the spare heir, destined perhaps for a comfortable life in the church, while Arthur ruled with the wisdom expected of a Tudor king. The baby was christened Henry, and for the first 10 years of his life, he lived in the golden shadow of his brother's destiny, receiving an education fit for a prince, but never truly expecting to wear England's crown. Fate, however, is the cruelest author of all, and she was already writing a very different story. When 15-year-old Arthur died suddenly in 1502, the entire trajectory of English history pivoted on that single tragic moment. Young Henry was yanked from his comfortable position as the spare and thrust into the blazing spotlight of royal expectation. The Tudor dynasty, still fragile and relatively new after the bloody Wars of the Roses, now rested its entire future on a boy who had never been groomed to rule an entire kingdom. Imagine, if you can, the crushing weight of that sudden responsibility, the mixture of terror and excitement that must have coursed through an 11-year-old child who suddenly realized that millions of lives would depend on his decisions. When Henry ascended to the throne in 1509, at age 17, he was nothing short of magnificent. Contemporary accounts describe him as standing 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, making him appear almost godlike among his courtiers. His hair gleamed like spun gold in the candlelight of court ceremonies, and his face possessed the kind of classical beauty that made visiting diplomats compare him to ancient Greek statues of Apollo. Venetian ambassadors wrote home describing his extraordinary figure and angelic countenance, declaring him superior in beauty to any Christian prince in Europe. But Henry's appeal went far beyond mere physical perfection. He embodied everything the Renaissance celebrated about human potential. He spoke fluent Latin, French, and Spanish, composing music that courtiers would hum for weeks after hearing it performed at royal festivities. His poetry made ladies swoon and impressed even the most cynical foreign diplomats. At court dances, he moved with such natural grace that he seemed to glide across the marble floors like something ethereal. During tournaments, he was absolutely devastating with lance and sword, yet he maintained the chivalrous demeanor of a knight from Arthurian romance. The English people didn't just respect their young king, they absolutely worshipped him. His court became the envy of the civilized world, a glittering center where art, music, literature, and learning flourished under his generous patronage. Nobles traveled hundreds of miles just to witness his legendary charm firsthand, and those lucky enough to gain his favor found themselves elevated to heights they never dared dream possible. These truly were golden days, filled with endless promise and possibility, and no one could have possibly predicted the monster this radiant prince would eventually become.
In those early years, Henry saw himself as Christianity's greatest defender, genuinely believing that God had placed him on England's throne specifically to protect the Catholic faith from heretics and reformers. When Martin Luther began challenging papal authority in Germany, Henry responded with the righteous fury of a true believer. He spent months crafting a brilliant theological treatise called Defense of the Seven Sacraments, written in elegant Latin and distributed across European courts to demonstrate England's intellectual commitment to Catholic doctrine. Pope Leo X was so impressed with Henry's scholarly defense of the faith that he awarded him the title Defender of the Faith, an honor that British monarchs still carry today, making it one of history's greatest ironies. How utterly impossible it would have seemed then to imagine that this same man would eventually become the Catholic Church's most dangerous enemy in all of England. But human nature has a way of transforming our greatest strengths into our most devastating weaknesses, and Henry's unwavering certainty about his divine mission would eventually become the foundation of his destruction. The catalyst for Henry's transformation came in the form of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a union that seemed politically brilliant at the time but would eventually tear apart the very fabric of English Christianity. Catherine had been married to Henry's brother Arthur for barely 5 months before death claimed her young husband, leaving her stranded in England as a 17-year-old Spanish princess whose future hung by the thinnest of political threads. The practical King Henry VII faced a dilemma that would echo through the ages, because returning Catherine to Spain meant sending back her enormous dowry, something the perpetually cash-strapped English crown could ill afford. The solution they devised was both clever and ultimately catastrophic. Young Henry would marry Catherine himself, but only after the Pope granted a special dispensation allowing him to marry his brother's widow. The court claimed that Arthur and Catherine's marriage had never been properly consummated, making it invalid in God's eyes, and thus removing any impediment to the new union. Pope Julius II agreed to the arrangement, and in 1509, shortly after Henry VIII ascended the throne, Catherine became his queen in a ceremony that seemed to solve everyone's problems perfectly. How tragically wrong they all were. This marriage, built on legal loopholes and political necessity rather than genuine compatibility, would eventually become the foundation for one of the most destructive religious revolutions in European history. For the first 15 years of their marriage, Henry and Catherine appeared to be a reasonably happy royal couple. But beneath the surface, a terrible anxiety was growing. Catherine gave birth several times, but infant mortality claimed most of their children, and only one child survived to adulthood, their daughter Mary. In a world where kingdoms could crumble without strong male succession, this felt to Henry like divine punishment for some terrible sin he couldn't identify. Everything changed when Anne Boleyn arrived at court in the mid-1920s. She wasn't the most beautiful woman Henry had ever encountered, but she possessed something far more dangerous than mere physical attractiveness. Anne had intelligence, ambition, and the absolute refusal to become just another royal discard when the king grew bored. When Henry began his passionate pursuit of her, Anne made it crystal clear that she would accept nothing less than marriage and a crown. She played a masterful game of romantic chess with the most powerful man in England, always staying one move ahead, always keeping him desperate for more. Their courtship became a political earthquake that shook all of Europe, because Henry's desire to marry Anne required him to declare his marriage to Catherine invalid. He begged Pope Clement VII to annul his first marriage, claiming it had been cursed from the beginning because canon law prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow. But Clement found himself caught between the English king's demands and the fury of Catherine's nephew, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who controlled much of Italy and could make the Pope's life very difficult indeed. As Clement delayed and stalled, desperately trying to avoid choosing sides in this royal dispute, Henry's patience evaporated entirely. If the church wouldn't give him what he wanted, then he would simply create his own church where he could make his own rules. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 was one of the most revolutionary documents in European history, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, answerable to no earthly authority except God himself. With breathtaking speed, monasteries across England were dissolved and their vast wealth flowed into royal coffers. Monks and nuns who had devoted their lives to spiritual service were turned out into the world with nothing. Anyone who refused to acknowledge Henry's supreme authority over the English church was branded a traitor and faced execution. The irony was staggering. The man who had once been Rome's greatest defender in Northern Europe became his most implacable enemy, and all for love of a woman who demanded nothing less than complete transformation of English Christianity to satisfy her ambition. But Henry's romantic life was destined to become an increasingly dark procession of heartbreak, betrayal, and horror. Catherine of Aragon, his loyal first wife, who had served faithfully for over 20 years, was cast aside like yesterday's garbage and exiled to a cold, damp castle where she died alone and forgotten, her heart broken by the man she had once loved. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry had literally torn apart English Christianity and defied the Pope himself, failed to produce the promised male heir that had justified their entire relationship. When Anne miscarried what might have been a son, and when political winds shifted against her family's influence at court, Henry decided she must have committed adultery and treason. The same woman he had once written passionate love letters to, calling her his most beloved and darling sweetheart, was arrested, tried on almost certainly fabricated charges, and executed on Tower Green. Her head was severed by a French swordsman's blade, while Henry was already courting his next wife just miles away. Jane Seymour, his third wife, finally gave him the son he desperately craved, but she died of childbed fever just days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Some historians suggest she was the only woman Henry ever truly loved, precisely because she gave him what he most wanted and then died before she could disappoint him or challenge his increasingly tyrannical behavior. Anne of Cleves, his fourth wife, was lucky enough to be merely divorced rather than executed, though Henry found her so physically repugnant that he could barely tolerate being in the same room with her. Poor Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was barely out of childhood when she caught the aging king's eye, and she was executed at just 19 years old on charges of adultery that were more likely youthful indiscretion than actual betrayal. Only Catherine Parr, his sixth and final wife, managed to survive him, and she accomplished this remarkable feat by being extraordinarily careful never to challenge his increasingly paranoid and violent moods, walking on eggshells around a man who had become capable of ordering anyone's death on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The turning point in Henry's transformation from magnificent king to monstrous tyrant came during a jousting tournament in January 1536, an event that would change the entire course of his life and, by extension, English history. Picture the scene. Thousands of spectators gathered at Greenwich Palace to watch their magnificent 44-year-old king display his legendary prowess in the lists. Henry, still convinced of his own invincibility despite his advancing years, charged down the field with his lance raised high, the crowd cheering his approach. But something went terribly, catastrophically wrong. His horse stumbled and fell with devastating force, and the full weight of both the massive war horse and Henry's armor-encased body crashed down on the king's right leg with bone-crushing impact. The sound that echoed across the tournament ground was sickening, a wet crack that made seasoned warriors turn pale with horror. For 2 agonizing hours, Henry lay unconscious on the muddy field while his physicians frantically worked to revive him, some courtiers whispering that perhaps England was about to lose another king to an unexpected accident. When Henry finally regained consciousness, everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing the crisis had passed and their king would recover as he always had from previous injuries. They were catastrophically wrong. That leg wound would never properly heal, becoming an open, weeping ulcer that would torment Henry for the remaining 11 years of his life, transforming him from a golden god into a rotting monster whose very presence became an assault on human senses. The smell that emanated from that festering wound was so appalling that courtiers could detect the king's approach from 3 rooms away, giving them time to prepare cloths soaked in perfume to press against their noses. Servants assigned to Henry's personal care had to be rotated frequently because even the most devoted couldn't tolerate prolonged exposure to the stench without becoming physically ill. As the years passed, the wound grew progressively more horrifying. Royal physicians tried everything their medieval knowledge could suggest, cauterizing the flesh with red-hot iron rods, applying poultices containing arsenic and mercury, even inserting gold tubes to help drain the constant flow of pus and blood. Nothing worked. The wound deepened until visitors could actually see Henry's leg bone through the decomposing flesh surrounding it. During his final months, gangrene set in with vengeance, turning the surrounding tissue black and filling the air around the king with the unmistakable stench of death itself. The man who had once been compared to Greek gods now carried the smell of a rotting corpse wherever he went, a living reminder of human mortality that terrified everyone around him. The constant, excruciating pain made it impossible for Henry to exercise as he once had, and his weight began to spiral completely out of control. His waist measurement expanded from a trim 35 inches in his athletic youth to over 50 inches by the end of his life. Court records suggest he eventually weighed nearly 400 pounds, requiring a complex system of pulleys and ropes just to move him from room to room within his own palaces. Doorways throughout his residences had to be widened to accommodate his massive bulk, and special armor had to be crafted for ceremonial occasions because no existing pieces could fit around his enormous body. Even his bed required structural reinforcement to support his tremendous weight without collapsing, and moving him became such a logistical challenge that his daily routine had to be completely restructured around his physical limitations. His daily consumption of food became absolutely staggering, with court records showing he consumed approximately 5,000 calories per day, mostly from red meat, rich sauces, and vast quantities of wine and ale. He almost ate no vegetables or fruits, considering them peasant food unfit for a king of his stature. This diet, combined with his complete inability to exercise, led to diabetes, gout, heart disease, and possibly other conditions that 16th century medicine couldn't even identify, let alone treat effectively. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the psychological changes that consumed Henry's personality. The constant pain, the humiliation of his condition, and possibly brain damage from his jousting accident transformed him into a paranoid tyrant who trusted absolutely no one and saw enemies lurking behind every smile. He became convinced that his food was being poisoned, requiring an elaborate tasting system where multiple servants had to sample every dish before it could reach his lips. He saw conspiracies everywhere, executing longtime friends and trusted advisors on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty or treason. The man who had once been Europe's most generous patron of arts and learning now turned his fury against his former religion with truly terrifying intensity. Thomas More, his brilliant chancellor and dear personal friend, was executed simply for refusing to acknowledge Henry as head of the English Church. Bishop John Fisher, an elderly scholar whose only crime was remaining loyal to Rome, suffered the same fate. Monks who resisted the dissolution of their monasteries were hanged, drawn, and quartered with medieval brutality, their body parts displayed as warnings to anyone else who might consider opposing the king's religious revolution. The same hands that had once written scholarly defenses of Catholic theology now signed death warrants for hundreds of people whose only crime was maintaining the faith Henry himself had once championed.
During his final years, Henry's condition became truly nightmarish to witness. He could barely move without extensive assistance from multiple servants, and his breathing grew increasingly labored and painful as his massive weight compressed his internal organs. Court observers reported frequent episodes of delirium where he would mutter the names of his dead wives, particularly Jane Seymour, suggesting that guilt over his treatment of them haunted even his unconscious moments. The smell from his rotting leg became so overwhelming that even his most devoted servants struggled not to vomit in his presence, and many requested transfers to other duties simply because they couldn't physically tolerate being near their dying king. Yet no one dared suggest openly that Henry was dying, because English law made it treasonous to predict the monarch's death, meaning that even acknowledging the obvious could result in execution. On January 27, 1547, Henry finally admitted that his end was approaching and called for Archbishop Thomas Cranmer to provide last rites. By the time Cranmer arrived at the palace, the king had lost the ability to speak coherently, his massive body finally succumbing to the multiple diseases that had been consuming him for years. When asked if he died in the Christian faith and trusted in Christ's mercy, Henry could only squeeze the archbishop's hand in what everyone interpreted as affirmation. In the early morning hours of January 28th, at the age of 55, the man who had once been called the most beautiful prince in all of Christendom finally breathed his last, his body too damaged and diseased to continue supporting life any longer. But even death couldn't end Henry's grotesque story, because his corpse had become so bloated and diseased that preparing it for burial presented unprecedented challenges that no previous royal funeral had ever encountered. A massive lead coffin had to be specially constructed to contain his enormous, decomposing remains, but even this extraordinary measure wasn't sufficient to contain what Henry had become. During the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, or while the coffin waited at the chapel at Sion Abbey, the internal pressure from Henry's decomposing organs caused the lead coffin to burst open, with horrifying results. Putrid fluids from the rotting royal corpse spilled across the sacred floor of the chapel, creating a scene so appalling that witnesses struggled to maintain their composure during what should have been a solemn religious ceremony. According to the horrified accounts of those present, stray dogs somehow found their way into the chapel during the night and were discovered lapping up the foul liquid that had leaked from their former king's burst corpse. Whether this detail represents literal truth or symbolic legend, it perfectly captures the utter degradation of Henry's final end. The man who had once commanded the fear and respect of all Europe, who had toppled governments and defied the Pope himself, had been reduced to nothing more than rotting meat that even scavenger animals found appetizing. The irony of Henry's legacy is perhaps the cruelest twist in his entire story. The male heir he sacrificed everything to obtain, his son Edward VI, died at just 15 years old, even younger than Henry's brother Arthur, whose early death had started this entire tragic cycle. Edward's brief reign was marked by religious instability and political chaos, hardly the strong Tudor dynasty Henry had envisioned when he tore apart English Christianity to secure his succession. Henry's true legacy came through the daughters he had dismissed as disappointments and failures. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's child, whom Henry had declared illegitimate, ruled England with iron determination for 5 years, though her reign became known as Bloody Mary due to her violent persecution of Protestants. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, who Henry had also declared illegitimate before later restoring her to the succession, became one of the greatest monarchs in English history, leading the nation into a golden age of exploration, literature, and prosperity that made England a dominant European power. The portraits hanging in museums today show us Henry as he desperately wanted to be remembered: majestic, powerful, intimidating, the very image of royal authority and divine right. But the true story of his life tells us something far more complex and infinitely more human about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the inevitable consequences of believing yourself above the laws that govern ordinary mortals. Henry VIII's transformation from golden prince to rotting monster serves as one of history's most powerful reminders that no amount of wealth, power, or royal blood can protect us from the fundamental realities of human nature and physical mortality. In seeking to control everything and everyone around him, Henry ultimately lost control of the one thing that mattered most: his own humanity. His story fascinates us precisely because it shows how close we all are to our own capacity for both extraordinary greatness and absolute monstrosity, separated only by the choices we make when faced with power, temptation, and the inevitable frustrations of human existence. The boy who began life as a spare heir, destined for obscurity, became one of history's most memorable monarchs,
but at a cost that ultimately consumed not just his own soul, but the lives of countless others who had the misfortune to cross paths with his increasingly destructive ambitions.